Welcome to the final lecture of the 2026 History Lecture Series. My name is Adam Warren, and I am Chair of the Department of History here at the University of Washington. I hope you have enjoyed the three superb lectures by Professors Mark Letney, Charity Urbanski, and Moon-Ho Jung earlier this month. Having recently watched a dress rehearsal of tonight's lecture by Professor Dan Berger, I can assure you that it is every bit as engrossing and fascinating as the other three. I would like to offer a special welcome to the Department of History's Access students, many of whom I met earlier this evening. It's lovely to have you here. It is not customary in this series for the department chair to speak at the final lecture, but this has not been a typical week in the Department of History. As some of you already know, one of our cherished colleagues and friends, Professor Vicente, or Vince Rafael, passed away on Saturday morning, February 21st. Vince had faced health challenges over the past few years, and in the last couple of months, his condition had worsened substantially. I offer my sincere condolences to Vince's wife, Leela Shahani, and to his friends and family, some of whom rushed to Seattle from Manila to say goodbye. It is hard to summarize Vince's enormous impact on the fields of Southeast Asian and Southeast Asian diaspora history and the study of empire and colonialism. As a specialist in Filipino history, his scholarship spanned the early modern and modern periods, from the 16th century Spanish invasions to the Duterte regime. It was ambitious, deeply researched, imaginative, and richly theoretical. Vince was the author and editor of 7 books and countless articles and book chapters, many of which shaped fields beyond Southeast Asian history and Southeast Asian studies. I remember vividly how reading his first book, Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society Under Early Spanish Rule, as a graduate student, taught me to ask better questions about evangelization practices in the Andes, my own area of focus. Vince also had plenty to say about the history of incarceration, the focus of this series, and the practices of the state that are entangled with it and that inform it. His last book, The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, was a study of Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's style of authoritarianism and entrenchment as a national leader. It paid particular attention to Duterte's war on drugs, his uses of violence, the excesses of policing under his rule, and his abysmal human rights record. Beyond his published scholarship, Vince also trained a substantial number of graduate students, some of whom are here tonight, at the University of Washington, the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Hawaii. Many of them have gone on to impressive careers of their own, and in that way continue his legacy. His undergraduate courses on Filipino histories and comparative colonialisms here at the University of Washington reached hundreds of undergraduates in our university and framed history in ways that were unfamiliar to them and changed how they saw the world. He participated extensively in academic life, both in the Philippines and in the United States. His last public talk was in Manila in December, and several years ago, he delivered a history lecture series talk during the pandemic. Vince lived the life of an intellectual. He approached the world with curiosity and found excitement and satisfaction in the study of the past and the present. He loved to explore ideas with others and did so enthusiastically. He will be greatly missed in our department, and we will find ways to honor his legacy in the months and years to come. As a first step, we dedicate the 2026 History Lecture Series to his memory. Thank you. I would now like to invite Professor Moon-Ho Jung to the stage.
All right, thank you, Adam. I really wish Vince were here with us tonight. He would be the first person to ask a question and it would have been, or he always asked a brilliant question. So I will miss Vince. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dan Berger. Although I could go on and on about Dan's many accomplishments, I will keep the intro short so that you can hear from him sooner rather than later. All right, Dan Berger is currently professor of comparative ethnic studies at UW-Bothell, where he has been teaching since 2012. He is a prolific scholar of the Black freedom movement and mass incarceration, including Black organizing inside prisons. So let me just highlight 4 of his publications. Dan is the author of the chapter, Carceral Journeys, published in the collection, The Rising Tide of Color, edited by that amazing historian, Moon Ho Jung. Dan is also the author of the book, Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2014, which won the James A. Raleigh Award from the Organization of American Historians for the best book on the history of race relations in the United States. Just 3 years ago in 2023, Dan published Stayed on Freedom, The Long History of Black Power in One Family's Journey. It was published by Basic Books, and it's a powerful and engaging story about 2 Black activists and the family and community they built together. And Dan is now at work completing his latest book project titled simply Prison, and the subtitle is Incarceration and the Making of America. That is scheduled to come out around this time next year. Dan Berger has also initiated and led many digital and public history projects, including the Washington Prison History Project. And I believe he'll be drawing from that project in his talk tonight titled The Washington Prison History Project, Counter Archives and Local Histories. So please join me in welcoming Dan Berger to the stage.
All right, thank you so much, Moon. It's always a grave danger to risk speaking after such a wonderful introduction, but I will do my best. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank my co-presenters in this series for the very stimulating lectures that we've been hearing all month, and just want to honor and pay tribute to Vince Raphael and the legacy that he leaves. We've been learning this month about the perhaps surprising history of the prison. We've learned that it is older in form and more varied in targets than it is often thought to be. There is no straight line connecting ancient Rome to medieval Europe to the modern United States. And yet that journey has also reaffirmed that the core function of the prison has remained relatively, but also, I would argue, remarkably stable over the centuries. The point of the prison is to reproduce power through punishment, typically aimed at the most marginalized or subversive elements of society. And I want to extend that insight and those themes that we've been talking about tonight by thinking about the historian's stock in trade, the archive. I want to make the case that we should think about the prison as an archive, which shapes the stories that get told about the institution. So like any history, the stories that we tell can change based on the archives that we consult. Mostly I'll talk about how that story changes when our sources include people who are or who have been in prison themselves. And I want to do so by examining what the history of prison tells us about the places that we call home. The prison is a living archive, steeped in the denial of the histories it confines. I wrote that sentence in the beginning of the book Captive Nation, which Moon graciously mentioned. That came out about 12 years ago, right? And the point of that book was looking at the role that incarcerated people played in the civil rights and Black Power movements as theorists and organizers. Simply put, we cannot understand the modern Black freedom struggle without understanding prison and what happened in prison and the expanse of prison that happened in its wake. North and South Black radicals met at the jailhouse door. While writing it, I was continually struck by the magnitude of history confined behind prison walls. While those walls themselves cannot talk, the people who are or who have been behind them can. And the stories that they have to share are discomforting, curious, violent, humorous, inspiring stories of the human condition. And in the United States, this archive lives primarily at the state level. What we call the prison system is actually a variety of different types of institutions that operate at different jurisdictions, but are primarily based at the state level. Most people are incarcerated in states, not local jails, federal or private prisons. So when I moved to Washington, I knew that its prisons were an archive of the state, but I knew little of the specifics that that archive would reveal. And I did not know and never could have imagined that I would be part of starting an archive, or a counter-archive, as I'll explain, to tell those histories. So what I would like to do tonight is preview what that archive says about Washington's history. I'll mostly talk about this idea of the counter-archive, which I'll define in greater detail. And I will discuss the Washington Prison History Project as an example of that counter-archive and explore the kinds of stories that this counter-archive allows us to tell and imagine. So it is not among its stated features or objectives, but prison functions as an archive. They create, categorize, record, preserve, and limit access to information. We often think about the prison as this kind of static, far-off, impermeable institution, but it is constantly generating documents of its own existence. Most of them are rather mundane and quotidian, like receipt for a package, applications for matches for someone who smokes, performance evaluation of someone's conduct inside, right? These are the kinds of documents that define the daily life of the prison archive. But it is not just the documents it generates, the paperwork it generates. The construction of the institution itself leaves its own archival imprimatur. So if you'll permit me to condense 140 years into about 3 minutes, we can see how the prison was an essential ingredient in the making of Washington as a part of the United States. The concept of prison was foreign to the indigenous people of the region. The Nez Perce, whose homeland includes part of what is today eastern Washington, had no word for prison. The word that they use for it translates as darkness. Yet it is a darkness that they would come to know. After ceding most of their lands in treaties between 1855 and 1871, the Nez Perce Reservation was continually shrunk via settler encroachment. After an 1877 war that saw some Nez Perce flee to Canada, they were incarcerated en masse and expelled from Washington Territory to the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and later to what was known as Indian Country in present-day Oklahoma. At the same time as the Nez Perce were being incarcerated outside of Washington Territory, the territory built its first prisons. So these were McNeil Island Prison, which opened in 1875, and a prison camp in Seatco, in the town that is today called Bucoda. A third prison, known as Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, opened in 1886, shortly before statehood. What's most remarkable about these facilities is how unremarkable they were. They resembled prisons in other parts of the country in their brutality, purpose, and exploitation of labor. So McNeil Island was the first of these to open. This was the first federal penitentiary in the West. It was the first island prison that the federal government operated. And it quickly became a way to enforce American power against both indigenous inhabitants and immigrants. Its first prisoners were men who violated the, quote, Indian prohibition laws that forbade selling alcohol to indigenous people. After the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which Moon spoke a little bit about last week, McNeil confined thousands of Chinese immigrants. It was a central node in what George Dudley Lawson, a participant in the 1885 pogrom to expel Chinese people from the city, described as the, quote, Tacoma method of racist exclusion. In 1891, McNeil joined Leavenworth and a yet-to-be-constructed penitentiary in Atlanta as the initial pillars of what is today the federal prison system. Island prisons are expensive, and so after a century, the federal government turned over the prison to the state of Washington, which ran it as a prison for about 30 years. And even though that prison closed, McNeil Island is today home to a novel form of incarceration known as civil commitment, where people are sentenced to potentially lifelong incarceration through civil processes rather than criminal for those who are considered, quote, sexually violent predators. The Seatco prison camp opened in 1877 under the province of the Thurston County Sheriff, who hired out the institution and its inhabitants to private businesses. This was a form of convict leasing, which is perhaps familiar to many of us, but often thought to be a feature of the Jim Crow South. Yet convict leasing was a national institution. Throughout its existence, prisoners at Seatco worked 12-hour days in leg irons, making doors, wooden barrels, and blinds. One man who was incarcerated there, named George France, called it hell on earth. Scandalous treatment and the opening of the Washington State Penitentiary closed Seatco, but now we have a new penitentiary. At the time that it opened, Walla Walla had the largest population in the territory. 3 years later, Washington became part of the United States. The following year, commissioners of the penitentiary informed the governor that the prison was full beyond its capacities, so that they would need to build a new cell block, which was done by prisoner labor. In fact, prisoners made the institution function. They prepared the food, washed the uniforms, tended the grounds. They made shoes and bricks, worked as blacksmiths and carpenters, labor that not only served the institution, but the broader community as well. Washington would build 3 more prisons over the next 90 years. The Washington State Reformatory in Monroe opened in 1910, Cedar Creek Correction Center outside Centralia in 1954, and Washington Correction Center near Olympia in 1964. Yet, in the 40 years after 1968, Washington built 11 new prisons. Some of these were entirely new institutions, like the first prison for women, Washington Correction Center for Women, first prison for women in the state, or Clallam Bay. Others, like the ones you see here, all that begin with the word Monroe, were new facilities that joined existing complexes. These new prisons went hand in glove with the policies that required them. Though often overshadowed by California, Washington was at the vanguard of shaping what we have come to call mass incarceration in the late 20th century. Washington largely eradicated parole in 1981, resulting in people spending more time in prison. It was the first state in the nation to enact a 3 strikes law, and the first modern state to sentence a 14-year-old to life without the possibility of parole. Washington's path was not unlike the rest of the country. New prison capacity went hand in glove with longer sentences and stiffer penalties. In the long era of austerity that began in the 1970s, the punishment industry was the only recession-proof industry. Hard-hit cities got more police, while hard-hit countrysides got more prisons, all while violent crime, beginning in the 90s, declined. Rehabilitation ceased to be the driving purpose of incarceration as punishment became its own reward. More people went to prison for longer periods of time and with less to do once they got there. And the stats from Washington, are proportional to the population, but again, this dramatic increase in a short period of time is reproduced around the country. These policies fell hardest on Black and Indigenous working class people in the prime of their lives. Now, I did not know any of those specifics about Washington State when I moved here in 2012, but I did know Ed Mead. Like many people who have been to prison, Ed grew up in poverty and experienced a variety of physical and sexual abuse. What began as juvenile delinquency led to a prison sentence at McNeil Island in the 1960s, where he became a radical. By the mid-1970s, Ed founded a revolutionary group called the George Jackson Brigade, named after a slain revolutionary prisoner in California. And the brigade's first official activity in 1975 was to bomb the Department of Corrections office in Olympia in connection with an uprising at the Washington State Penitentiary. After a failed bank robbery not long after, Ed ended up at the penitentiary himself. While there, he continued to be a troublemaker as a writer, an amateur escape artist, and a co-founder of a quixotic anti-rape organization called Men Against Sexism. Ed was released from prison in 1993 and continued to write, speak, and agitate against prisons. 10 years ago, while recuperating from the lung cancer that ultimately would take his life, he contacted me about donating his papers to the university. When I asked Denise Hatwig, who is the head of digital collections at the UW-Bothell Library, about taking on Ed's material, her only condition was that he agreed to have them scanned, digitized, and made freely available to the public. When I presented this to Ed, he said copyright is a tool of the bourgeoisie that he had no interest in, and it was a wonderful meeting of the minds. So Ed donated 3 trunks of materials. So you can see the example of one of these trunks on the right. In helping Denise process these materials, I saw that they were not just his personal papers, but they were a treasure trove of a collective experience of the rise of mass incarceration and how people in prison experienced that, understood it, negotiated it, challenged it, from the perspective of incarcerated people themselves. These were materials that provided little heard but persistent voice about the realities of prison. This was a vital opportunity to tell an alternative story to the common narrative of incarceration, and this was the birth of the Washington Prison History Project. As a society, we are often asked to interpret the prison as a necessary good, whether for profit, rehabilitation, or punishment. Yet the sources of that interpretation are largely the institution itself: the police, the prosecutors, the judges, the corrections officials who make up the legal system. But there is another tradition, which historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez calls the rebel archive, and what I want to think about and ask us to think about tonight as a counter-archive. The idea of a counter-archive, I'll quote the scholar Mahdi Ganjavi, who describes it as an alternative archival practice that seeks to offer alternative ways of remembering, preserving, and accessing information. It not only gives us different interpretation, it gives us new, typically excluded data from which to interpret. Traditional archives often collect the documents and experiences of powerful people, whereas counter-archives gather the stories of the less powerful. And crucially, and something that will be throughout my remarks, counter-archives are collaborative works of recovery and reconstruction. So a lot of my work in Captive Nation and other books that I've worked on has relied on these sort of alternative archives, these counter-archives, right? Documents that were held in dusty attics, in moldy basements, or dank prison cells. But it has been a different prospect altogether to build one. So I want to use the rest of my time this evening to talk about the Washington Prison History Project as a counter-archive. And those of you who can't wait to check it out, this QR code will take you there. So the project has had a couple of different lives, right? It began with the happy accident of Ed's donation of materials and realizing how rich they were. And in that first 7 or 8 years of the project, it was a volunteer initiative that Denise and I undertook. In her role as head of digital collections for the library, Denise handled the arrangement and processing of the materials, while I conducted oral histories, helped procure additional archival donations, and worked to contextualize them, often with student support. We did this as best we could on top of our regular jobs. But about 1.5 years ago, we were fortunate enough to get a new lease on life with a grant from the Mellon Foundation that allowed us to hire 3 full-time staff members to coordinate, conduct, and curate research. Throughout that process, we have been continually guided by that public open access mission that is our founding. And I think that's important not just to us as a counter-archive, but specifically as a counter-archive of prison, an institution that is designed to be remote, opaque, and difficult to access. So, as a counter-archive, the Washington Prison History Project works to change how we understand prison by expanding both the sources and the storytellers. Since 2017, we have amassed thousands of documents, photos, oral histories, and other ephemera speaking to the history of Washington prisons from the perspective of people inside them. Again, many of these items might seem otherwise mundane: letters to loved ones, legal appeals, flyers from symposia that incarcerated people organize. They include a collection of prisoner-produced newspapers that are not only fascinating in their own right as documents that were written and edited entirely by people in prison, but also allow us to chart how those ideas change over time in relation to broader social, political, and legal dynamics. So we have a newspaper in the middle that Ed, not surprisingly, was a part of, called the Red Dragon, that began in the late 1970s, that becomes The Abolitionist in the late 1980s, and grows into Prisoners' Legal News in 1990, a publication that still publishes to this day, now under the name Prison Legal News. We have been a repository for materials that otherwise would not be archived and not be accessible. But more than that, we have adopted a constructive approach, which is to say that we are not just preserving materials that wouldn't be archived or available, but we're also trying to generate archival materials that would not be accessed or available. These include dozens of oral histories with currently and formerly incarcerated people, which are recorded, transcribed, reviewed, and posted with participants' approval, as well as materials from something called the Gender and Incarceration Research Group, led by Professor Tanya Erzin at the University of Puget Sound. So there's a lot that I could talk about the project and the different initiatives that we've undertaken. We are constantly adding new things to the collection and to our website. And again, I invite you to peruse that at your leisure. But I want to highlight 3 examples, right, or 3 kind of thematic examples that we have undertaken through the project: community, resilience, and imagination. Each of these is evident in the materials that we've gathered, and they speak to the ways that, as Moon was highlighting last week, that resistance is both dramatic and quotidian, but above all, ever-present, right? It exists in many forms all the time. And each one of these examples speaks to, or rather confronts, the isolation, stagnation, and separation that otherwise define prison life. So first, we'll talk about community. And I want to acknowledge the disjuncture at using a word like community atop a picture that shows seemingly the opposite, right? The atomization of life in prison. But that tension is at the heart of everything in prison. Right? And this is especially true of COVID-19. When the pandemic started, prisons quickly became a hotspot, as was evident to anyone who was familiar with prison, right? Much more so than cruise ships and nursing homes, which understandably garnered a lot of public attention. But there were simply too many people serving too much time in too crowded institutions. All programming was canceled for people's safety, and yet social distancing was impossible. The primary options for quarantining people who might be sick or might have been exposed were solitary confinement, right? The sort of classic mark of punishment, or congregating everyone together in the gym, which only spread illness further. So we began to receive in March 2020 a number of panicked communications about what the pandemic meant for people in prison. These included letters, poems, diary entries, even transcripts of incarcerated people interviewing each other. In March 2020, we published or received and put on our website this statement from the Concerned Lifers organization, which is a long-standing civil society organization inside of the Washington State Reformatory in particular. And, this statement speaks not only to the desperation of living inside a prison during a respiratory virus, but actually demonstrates a seasoned policy approach in a moment where people were talking about the crisis that the pandemic posed for people in prison. Members of the CLO had been tracking, not only through their lived experience, but also through their lived experience, 4 decades of punitive sentencing policy. And they knew what sorts of policies could result in, could ease the overcrowding and save lives. So this statement calls for the return of earned release time as something that had been stripped away in the buildup of mass incarceration that resulted in so many elderly people being incarcerated. Not surprisingly, most of the items that we received did speak to the terror of being incarcerated during a pandemic. While many people on the outside casually refer to the stay-at-home orders as lockdown, people in prison were placed on actual lockdowns. They were unable to leave their cells for long stretches of time and at the mercy of others for basic information. Chris Blackwell, an incarcerated man who became a well-regarded journalist during this period, sent us the daily journal he kept during the first 2 years of COVID. In it, he describes the quotidian claustrophobia of the pandemic. And I've just presented this excerpt here where he's talking about 150 people crowded around a shared kiosk without any cleaning supplies to ensure safety in between usage, to read information from the Department of Corrections about the ever-changing policies of prison. And they had to decide, people in prison had to decide, Chris recounts, between reading that information or calling their loved ones during these brief visits outside their cell. And the kiosks that he's talking about, you can see here, right? These are sort of centrally located devices where people could access a kind of proprietary email system or receive these updates from the Department of Corrections. This, I should note, has changed somewhat now that incarcerated people have their own tablets. But at the time, this was the primary way to maintain communication with the outside. Over the last 2 years, with the project, we have been digging further into the story of how the pandemic upended life in prison. The archive reveals the routine functioning of prison is in direct conflict with the aims and objectives of public health. With a UWB master's student, now alumna, Sydney Pope, who has done incredible research to recreate the Department of Corrections policy landscape over those 2 years, which has largely been wiped from public access. She and the Prison History Project's outreach manager, Demetris Wood, have conducted in-depth oral histories with a dozen currently or formerly incarcerated people about their experience. And across these hours of testimony, people describe a policy that toggled between malice and incoherence. They describe being isolated, being made vulnerable to exposure from staff who treated them as a source of risk, and of being required to work without access to proper PPE. But they also talk about the community that they forged, trying to help each other survive, not only COVID, but prison. So I want to play a very brief excerpt from 3 of these oral histories, all of whom are with people who are still incarcerated. Because of that, right, these are oral histories that were conducted over the phone, which means, particularly in the first clip, you'll hear that the audio quality is not great. So I'll have a transcript just of the first clip that will come up, but I think it's also important to demonstrate the kind of conditions that we're doing this work under.
Being able to touch people, because we're like, after a while you'll feel like, man, they're killing off your senses, man. As being a human, your sense of smell, your sense of your sight, you're seeing the same old shit every day. You're tasting the same food, or the action that being able to touch somebody. You know what I mean? Just all your 5 senses, man. They were getting shot at, so they're like, I felt dehumanized with this pandemic. So the little action that I got to exercise those senses is what kept me together.
I think that we started coming together more as the virus spread. And I say this because I've never, even in my time now, have never seen such care and concern for people. People are worried for people to go to SEG when the pandemic was going on. We didn't want to see people have their stuff packed up and have to go. So a lot of the time, if we saw someone sick, we would go tell them, hey, go stay in your room and don't come out. You know what I mean? Or don't go down to medical. Don't do this, trying to cover for people. When I was working, or when my friends were working, we would cover their shift for them and just say that, they're going through a depression right now. We would make excuses for people, and because you couldn't even say that someone had a headache or someone's stomach wasn't feeling well, because then they would send somebody to go test them.
We grew a lot closer as a community in the sense of knowing that DOC could rip you out of your house and throw you in quarantine, and you'd never see that person again because they could die, or you never know what can happen. We kind of built more of a status quo community. We definitely had even if you didn't know your next door neighbor, if he was walking around smelling crummy, you'd give him a bar of soap. It really structured that us versus them mentality. The inmates versus DOC. It kind of just put a really good rock in the middle of that, because DOC did not have any good preparation set in place, and so when things went crazy, the only thing I could say we could do to help each other was just to make sure everybody had what they needed. Now, as far as COVID and getting sick, I mean, you could ask your neighbor for some ibuprofen, and that's about all you got.
Those second 2 clips were easier to hear in the rehearsal than maybe they were tonight. But across these and the other oral histories that we've gathered, people in prison speak of the ways that they had to rely on each other to survive an institution in the throes of exaggerating deprivation. People looked out for each other with what meager resources they had, and they worked together to prevent not only sickness, but segregation. You may or may not have heard the second speaker talk about the fear of being sent to SEG, put in SEG, right? Being punished for being sick, or whether that's COVID or, as she said, a headache or anything else, right? So these voices speak to the effort to pursue community and what's required to sustain it under those conditions. But the pandemic was hardly the first time that people in prison have had to band together, right? Indeed, that is the constant, right? These forms of subversive solidarity against the institution, but also sometimes against other people at it. And Washington has an incredible and too little known history of this regard. In the 1970s, the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla was one of a handful of institutions that was home to an experiment at having expanded prisoner participation in the running of the institution. These efforts, wherever they happened, were typically led by a single reform-minded administrator confronting the violence of the institution and wanting to make American prisons closer to their European counterparts. And yet they were undermined from the beginning. Many guards and wardens hated these efforts, and they never lasted long. But for several years, the Washington State Penitentiary experienced a combination of openness and chaos. The prison was a blend of both boredom and explosive energy. Incarcerated people were allowed to wear civilian clothes. They formed new affinities born of both self-preservation and experimentation. Of particular note, the penitentiary was home to a biker gang, a biker club that was a combination of different biker gangs that came together and had access to motorcycles to ride or repair in the yard. I mentioned briefly Men Against Sexism that Ed Mead was a part of, which was both a political action group that formed to stop the prevalence of rape and sexual violence in prison, which targeted queer and trans prisoners as well as just more effeminate prisoners, but also was a social club where people could develop consensual relationships, both platonic and romantic. Indigenous prisoners organized sweat lodges and other forms of ceremony, and the Black Prisoners Forum Unlimited started an organizing and education tradition that continues to this day. Much of what we know and these pictures that I'm sharing throughout my slideshow this evening come from a very auspicious work of photojournalism that happened at the penitentiary in 1978. John McCoy and Ethan Hoffman, who you see pictured here, were fresh out of journalism school and when they got a job at the Walla Walla town paper and were assigned to what the newspaper considered the worst beat they had, the prison beat. They recognized the novelty of the experiment that was happening behind the walls and managed to convince the warden to give them unprecedented access to the institution. They later published their results in an incredible work of photojournalism called The Concrete Mama, which came out in 1981 and won a Washington State Book Award and was briefly banned from the state prison system before later being welcomed in as a kind of badge of honor. Through the Washington Prison History Project and working in tandem with UW Press, we were able to publish a second edition of the book in 2018, and I believe members of the press have copies of the book outside the lecture hall. The Hoffman family also donated all of his photo negatives from the time in prison to the project, which we are in the process of digitizing and putting online. Now, by the time the book appeared, the experiment at Walla Walla had come to an end, leading to a further increase of chaos and kind of internecine conflict behind the walls. Due to a class action lawsuit in 1980, Judge Tanner declared that conditions at the penitentiary violated, quote, society's minimum standards of decency, inflict purposeless pain and suffering, and therefore constitute cruel and unusual punishment. As a result of that ruling, the penitentiary was placed under federal monitoring, which was happening to either individual prisons or, in some cases, whole state prison systems throughout the country in the late 70s and 80s. And this was the start of a kind of complicated process of modernizing the prison, the specifics of which exceed our time tonight, but included, a more professional prison, but also a more bureaucratized one and a more atomized one. But the legacy of the 1970s and the work that was happening inside can be found across a number of what I think we should consider civil society organizations that exist in prison. I mentioned the Concerned Lifers organization, groups like the Asian Pacific Islander Cultural Awareness Group, the Latino Development Organization, the Black Prisoners Caucus, and Tribal Sons continue that effort of incarcerated people coming together for their own growth, education, and collective betterment within, but often despite, the prison context. This legacy also informs how prison systems and the people in them responded to federal laws that might otherwise not deal specifically with prison, but would have a bearing on the people in them. One such example is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, which was not specific to people in prison, but had a great deal of relevance to them. It provided a sort of legal framework and context, legal authorization for Indigenous people to preserve, uphold their cultural heritage across pan-tribal affiliations. That's a story that involves people across many different tribes and different generations working together at a time when Indigenous people, and in Washington, where Indigenous people experience the most disparate incarceration in the state. So to tell part of that story, we've been partnering with Hoyt, an Indigenous nonprofit organization that provides educational, rehabilitative, and religious support for Indigenous prisoners in the Pacific Northwest on a documentary about the ongoing fight for Native religious freedom in prison. We've been working on this for about 6 months, have done maybe a dozen interviews thus far. In the spring, we're going to, we were able to get permission from the Department of Corrections to film some interviews inside of Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, and perhaps other facilities to film the ceremony that happens, to interview people, including one person who was first profiled in Concrete Mama more than 40 years ago. But tonight, I'm very pleased to share with you an exclusive trailer about the work that we've done in this documentary thus far.
Native, everything got to be in harmony with the next thing for it all to be strong and all to work, powwow, our sweat. It's one day that we're free from all this, that nothing else exists but that ceremony, that fellowship.
Indian people cannot be white. They have to be who they are. You may teach them, train them to live in the white world, but they must be allowed to remain as Indians and to practice their own religion and philosophy.
The civil rights movement was just coming into Indian country, and really at the inception of the modern era of federal Indian law, jumping into these important cases to facilitate that great social movement back then.
When you consider that our population is about 800,000, and over half of them are women and children and young people, and you consider that we have literally thousands of Indian men in prisons throughout this country, you have to be concerned.
They built the jail on one of our islands called McNeil Island. My father growing up, his mother, Janet, my grandmother, would take him and his brother into these jail systems to show and also talk and help, because she seen that they were not getting, their religion or their spirituality.
I mostly was out in the community, and I got a call, and this guy said that he was in Walla Walla. He talked about the abuse that the guards were doing, really cruel, very nasty punishment, and he asked me for help, and then he got cut off. And then I called the state specialist on Indian affairs. The next thing I knew, there was a committee going to Walla Walla to investigate.
All of this activism gave rise to a right to have those practices brought in to the prisons. As I understand the Religious Freedom Act, there was movement to both bring people in to teach our incarcerated relatives who are serving time how they could access their birthrights, their traditional spiritual practices.
Preparing for powwow, taking part in sweats, going to drumming is so instrumental to rehabilitation, to being proud of who you are, and learning how to become a responsible person. I think my culture is how I was saved. That's the first and foremost. Before I became a student, before I became a painter, I became an Indian again.
So we're very excited. As I said, production continues through the spring and summer, but hopefully we'll have a documentary to share in the next 1 to, let's say, 10 years. Finally, I want to turn to imagination. Right? A counter-archive enriches our understanding of the past. It contextualizes the present, but it can also illuminate a possible future or possible futures. So I want to close with an unexpected find from the archive. In processing Ed's initial donation of materials, I found this on a dot matrix printer, right, with the little holes on the side. Those of you in the room who have experience with archival work may know something of that feeling when your back hurts and you're sitting at a table for too long and you're going through papers, and all of a sudden you find something so totally unexpected yet profoundly cool that a light shines on you and you can hear harps start to play and everything just comes into focus. Well, that was this moment for me, finding this programming code in the archive. This code dates to about 1987 when computers first arrived at the Washington State Reformatory. And Ed got very excited about computers, right? Both the hardware and the software. He started a club, the programmers users group. He had a computer in his cell for a brief time, right? And all of that skill and that experience allowed him to, when he got out of prison, to get a job in IT, right? And have a much softer reentry experience than most. But before that, right, back when he didn't know when or whether he would be getting out, he designed a text adventure computer game. Some of you may remember these early computers, these early computer games, back before computers had graphics, where you're presented with a scenario and you choose how among a few pre-select options of how you want to respond, and then deal with the consequences. The closest I ever came to a career in basketball was playing a text adventure basketball game around the same time that Ed designed the Warden game. So finding this code was very exciting. Right? And I happened to be working with a student at the time, now an alumna, named Magdalena Donea, who had a background in tech, and so we were able to take that code and recreate it. And you see some of Maggie's work here of what it took to recreate the game. So Ed designed this game for his own pleasure, right? His own amusement and the amusement of his friends. So he never considered that it would be played by anyone else. So we felt very strongly in recreating it that we had to stay true to Ed's code, right? This was his game, not ours. He made all the choices, not us. We just wanted it to be playable as the profound historical artifact that it was. So all we did was correct any errors in code over time, and then we annotated some terms that might be jargon or otherwise unclear to people if you had not spent the kind of time in prison that Ed had. So today, the Warden game is playable freely on our website, and I'd like for us to play a little bit of it here this evening. Now, the Warden game puts you in the position of being Warden as imagined and understood by a queer communist prisoner. You do not need to know anything about prison for the game to work, but the more you do know about the history of prisons generally and the prisons in Washington specifically, the more you realize how much the game is actually based in Ed's experience and other real-life examples at the time, which he then expands in some sly and speculative fashion. So let's all play. So the Warden game begins with a little bit of background of your situation report, right? And you see where it says maximum security institution is in orange, right? Anytime you see orange on the screen, that's something that I annotated. So if you click on it in the game, these are just screenshots, so I can't do it. But if you click on it in the game, it'll bring up a little sidebar that tells you what a maximum security institution, what that means, right? But so our context collectively as warden, right? We are warden of a maximum security institution with about 1,000 people, right? The families of the incarcerated visit, they're paying attention to what's happening inside. The guards, mostly men who have been there for a very long time, who believe in the proven concept of tight security, but there's some difference, right, with the younger guards and women guards have a softer attitude toward the prisoners. But budget cuts, lots of austerity have reduced the quantity and quality of food, programming, services, and so on. All right, that's the background to the prison that the 200 of us or so run together. So now the game begins. Right? We're sitting in our office pondering things when the captain comes and says we've been getting kites, which are essentially letters, memos from incarcerated people, saying that there are 6 prisoners who are stirring up anti-administration sentiment. So what are we going to do? Well, our options are to transfer them out of state, to lock them up in the hole, to call in the most rights conscious, to hear their complaints, to have the captain give them some special privileges, or to ignore it. So for the sake of argument, let's lock them in the hole for investigation. Good choice. We can't afford to be too liberal during these hard times. Give them an inch today, and they will want a whole mile. But our harsh measures have caused an increase in prisoner resentment, which may lead to future unrest. So uneventful weeks have passed. Next thing we know, the captain comes in with a sheaf of paper saying it's a prisoner newsletter, put out with typewriters and carbon paper. And I think carbon paper might be the only non-prison term that we annotated for a younger audience. But again, we now have these series of choices. We can order a general lockdown. We can send the 6 back to the hole. We can inform the captain that we'll read the document and make a decision later, or allow it to continue. So let's try that option. Well, now we've aggravated senior members of the guard staff who've told officials in the state capitol that we have not suppressed this prisoner newsletter. The head of the Department of Corrections has called us and demanded that we make every effort to crush the newspaper. Our options again, lock down and search the prison, right? That's a constant option. Refuse to suppress the paper or order guards to investigate any future publishing tries. Let's try this middle option. Refuse to suppress the paper. So now more or less quiet months have passed when all of a sudden there's been a major strike organized statewide. Every major prison in the state is shut down, not in protest of conditions, but in protest of US intervention in Central America. This has been organized with the progressive community on the outside, as well as the friends and family group helping to coordinate communication. So we can call this work stoppage actually a lockdown and try to regain narrative control. We can withhold any concrete actions until we hear from the Department of Corrections, or we can try to listen to the prisoner representatives. Right? Let's assume we're feeling generous and try that option. And when we talk to them, we learn that they seek a greater voice in the operation of the prison. Prisoners could not have done a worse job than what we've been doing in terms of protecting the public's interest, and that prisoners need things like anti-sexist education. They need connections and contact with the outside. right? So our options now have narrowed to two, right? We can get tough with them, implement the repression plan against these subversives, or give them as much rope as they can and hope that they hang themselves while we protect our job, right? If we try that option, we find out that we end up with a final score of about 75%, which means we can hopefully avoid ending up in a re-education camp, but we would be well advised to study the role that prisons play in regulating the class struggle between rich and poor. So, the logic of the warden game is the logic of prison, at least as Mead understood it. Be too liberal and risk blowback from the state. Be too harsh and risk a prisoner strike. The game rewards a kind of just right social control that is worked out not in isolation, not in idealism, but in the negotiation between officialdom and the rabble. The game recognizes that dissent, whether large or small, is ever present. Incarcerated people publish their own newspapers, form their own groups, and seek to have a voice not just in the running of the institution, but in the running of society. The prison of the warden game is not ruled by the warden. Rather, it is made through dynamic contention from above and from below. Ultimately, what the warden game tells us is that the most powerful person in charge of the prison is constrained on all sides. And if the head of the prison is not as powerful as he seems, then maybe prison is not as powerful as it seems either. So what the counter archive shows is what has lurked behind this whole series. The prison is not a far-off place of bad guys and boogeymen. It is neither inevitable nor unchanging. Rather, prison is a persistent form of social control that the state uses against its enemies, political, racial, economic, and otherwise. Prison not only houses resistance, it produces resistance. And most of all, prison is a reflection of the society we live in. We have an obligation, I think, to study prison and to listen to the experiences of those who have survived it or who are surviving it now, knowing that they are our friends and families and neighbors. Living in a country that solves problems with prison impacts us all differently, but it impacts all of us. And because prison doesn't solve the problem, it was ostensibly built to solve, the problems will continue to grow and fester until we solve the problem of prison itself. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me ask the first question. I think you've answered this question pretty much throughout the talk, but can you just talk a little bit more about how the idea of counter-archives, as you put it, expands our understanding of resistance, both inside the prison and perhaps beyond the prison?
Yeah, for a long time, our tagline was documenting activism and policy, or prisoner activism and policy. And recently, meeting with our advisory board, they said, it's not just activism and policy, right? There's stories, there's everyday life, there's a sense of just what being in prison entails that is broader than even we had recognized, right? And so I think, not just understanding that there is this kind of constant power struggle that defines being in a cage, but actually trying to shift the focal point to incarcerated people really proliferates our sense of what is happening, right, as well as what is possible. And I think that's particularly vital on the outside of prison because it expands our sense of how people can do things, right? I do an activity with my students sometimes where I say, okay, if we were planning something on campus, like how would we do it? And people say, okay, we'd go to social media, we'd set up a table outside the library, right? They come up with all these things. And I say, okay, imagine you don't have social media and your movements are restricted. Like, how are you going to tell people about the thing that you're trying to do, right? And so I think there's a kind of continual celebration of human beings as social animals that comes from studying actually what people in prison do and how they do it. that I think has a great deal to inform us on the outside as well as what's happening on the inside.
All right, thank you. I don't see any questions in the queue. All right, let me ask a second question then. So it's going to be an interview.
Great.
So you talked a little bit about the prison reforms of the 1970s, right? And you framed it as resilience and perhaps a form of resistance. But could you also read those reforms as methods of appropriation, as a way to repress perhaps more radical expressions inside the prison? So I guess another way to ask the question would be, how do you mark that divide between the archive, the official archive, and the counter archive?
Great question. There's a lot there. I mean, I think you have, a proliferation of actors in the 70s where you have, a group of reformers who are open and interested in incarcerated people's notions of what the historian Amanda Bell Hewitt talks about as the participatory prison, right? How can people inside co-create the prison experience, right? Govern it together. And I think there's an argument there of what you're saying about appropriation, right? That this could be a form of containment, that if people are allowed to, help set the terms of their captivity, then they won't question their captivity as much. And I think that genuinely was the rationale, right? That was the argument. But the fact that argument was so challenging to most of the powers that be, that it was tamped down and diminished entirely, right? Not just diminished, it was we have in Washington, there was at the penitentiary, there was an uprising, or not an uprising, there was a fight, and during the fight, a guard was stabbed and killed. Following that, in 1979, a group of guards formed what they called a revenge squad that went around terrorizing different prisoners, right? And that campaign of terror is what led to the judge's ruling that the prison system was a violation of the Eighth Amendment. So I think there's a way in which prison officials could have had appropriation, right? They could have had a kind of a peace, but the idea of that peace was so challenging that I think they went, hard right to sort of how do we have a full control, right? A sort of full authoritarian ownership of the institution.
All right, we have some questions, and I also see a bunch of questions from last week, actually, that I wish we had gotten to because they're pretty good.
Well, we can take turns.
Anyway,
yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, does your archive offer any insight into women's experiences inside Washington's prisons?
Yeah, this has been a growing part of the archive. So several of those prisoner newspapers that I spoke about, even though they were housed at men's prisons, have writings from women's prisons that are really worth looking at. But I've been very thrilled by the partnership with the Gender and Incarceration Research Group that I mentioned that has garnered hundreds of documents about the history of incarceration of women and girls in the state. And those are slowly coming on to the site. Right now we have a short essay from Tanya Erzin about some of those documents and what it reveals. I think chief among them is that the history of women and girls incarceration doesn't take the form of prison until much later than it does for men, right? So you have these kind of wayward homes for girls, you have, sometimes private charities, sometimes state agencies that are very invested in a kind of gendered training, but they don't call themselves prison until much later on than happens for men.
All right, here's a very broad question. Can this system be reformed?
I think Foucault had this great line that Angela Davis also recirculates, which is that the system itself is reform, right? That the prison is always in the process of being reformed. Mark gracefully illustrated the limitations of Foucault's argument as a history, which I agree with. But I think his point about the prison as an institution of reform, right? Whether that's the state trying to reform itself, but also the state creating an institution devised to reform others, right? Reform is always at the heart of the institution, and I think that the continual failures of the institution to do what we think it is there to do should cause us to question whether that reform is desirable, right? And I think it pushes us to ask some different questions.
All right, we got a bunch now. How did the ability of those incarcerated change with the sharp spike in incarceration during the latter half of the 20th century?
How did the ability change?
Yes, that's what it says.
So, there's a lot to say there. Right? I'll just say quickly, since there are a number of questions, that the number of people who were going to prison accelerated rather quickly, that it took a long time to really figure out the kind of forms of response. But I think these civil society organizations, the Lifers group, these different cultural groups that I mentioned, have really generated a sense of kind of purpose for people inside, right? For their own education and betterment, but also to be able to make connections with people outside.
All right, we've got a couple of questions asking about potentially other counter-archival projects in other states and how they might be similar to or different from what you have found in Washington State.
Yeah, there are several, and they all have their own kind of spin on it. I think I was talking with somebody today who runs a similar kind of project about Michigan. Although I think that one is more top-heavy, right? More about the policy side, not exclusively, but more about the policy side. There's one out of Johns Hopkins University that is a prisoner writing archive, so that's writings from all over the country. So it doesn't have the geographical focus that we have. There's one in California called $1 Million Hoods by Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who I mentioned. That's very specific to Los Angeles, right, and sort of policing practices in LA. So I think there are these different scales from these different projects that are really interesting. But I think we're all telling different parts of a shared story.
All right. Here's another question. Are there any dramatic examples of radical reform? That sounds like an oxymoron to me, but okay, but are there any dramatic examples of radical reform in the United States in corrections, given the enormous cost to taxpayers and profits to private corporations in our status quo?
I think the simplest answer is no. That we've seen, the radical reform project is what the rest of the question narrates here. Right? Is the sort of seemingly ceaseless growth of the prison system. I think COVID was a moment where some very dramatic changes were possible, and what we saw in place after place after place was that prison systems and state governments were more invested in shoring up the legitimacy of the institution than in being driven by what public health recommended, right? Which was mass releases as fast as possible to safe institutions, and that's not what happened.
Okay, how do you see the counter archives helping to form policy and reform decisions at the state, local, and federal levels?
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one process, but I think we have to tell a different story about prison, right? And anytime we talk about prison, or when people, sit around the proverbial table to set policy, incarcerated people are rarely present, right? The family members of incarcerated people are rarely present unless they themselves have mobilized to get themselves there. So I think what projects like these do, at least I hope, is help provide both the raw material for different stories, but also, right, the different stories themselves. And I think as we start to do that, we can then think about prisons differently, including politically or in the policy arena.
Okay, I'll combine these two questions. Are there efforts to archive or preserve the viewpoint of the prison guards, wardens, and other staff? Another question, are incarcerated people finding any opportunities for co-creation or productive dialogue with prison officials in the current moment?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the well-placed to answer that last question. I think, we're in a kind of golden age of prisoner podcasts. There's 2 that I know of in Washington, 3 actually that I know of in Washington, but 2 of them are produced with institutional approval. And so whether that creates possibilities for dialogue, I think we'll have to see. There are some, Whitman College has an archive about Walla Walla that includes more of guard and warden perspectives. There are different projects that study prison guards. I don't know if there's an archive like this about that perspective.
Okay, and then we have a couple questions regarding, trying to generate a counter-archive in the digital age. So can you talk a little bit about, opportunities and perhaps limitations of trying to do this work in our current moment in terms of the technology?
Yeah, there's a lot of limitations in our current moment that are not about the technology, but one obvious one is that we have access to all this technology that that incarcerated people cannot access, right? So that is evolving and changing. People do have access to these tablets, as I mentioned, but all of that is in a very constrained and limited platform that people have to pay for, even things that we would all be able to access for free. Right? There are lots of issues there. So I think we have an ability to do this website, put everything on the website. Nothing that we put on the website is accessible to people in prison because it's on the website, right? So we've also had to then work to make sure, when we do, people's oral histories, we have to send those oral history transcripts in for their approval. We're working on creating an index of the items that we have in our collection that we can send inside so that people can request materials for their own research and writing that they might be doing. So I think there's a lot of kind of duplication of effort that's necessary in order to reach people in prison that we can just hit publish and make it available publicly otherwise.
Okay, why don't we take 2 more? Does your archival project address the experiences of families visiting loved ones? Families often experience hardship and abuse in the process.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is very true. That has not formally been a part of what we've done. It is around the edges, right? It comes up in some oral histories. It's certainly one of the chapters of Concrete Mama deals with the visitor experience. One of the chapters also deals with the guard experience. So it's there in some of the things that we've done, but it has not yet been a central part of our focus.
Okay, the last question. Has portrayals of prison and film, Shawshank, Escape from Alcatraz, been helpful in raising awareness and public support for prisoners, or just reinforced harmful stereotypes of prison life?
I think between those 2 options, I would have to say yes. Because there's not one answer, right? It obviously depends on who's listening, who's watching. But also, part of the appeal of Shawshank is that he is a framed man, right? And I think part of a lot of what is true of the archive is, a lot of people are in prison for things that they may have done. And so if we are only thinking about it in the realm of innocence and framed, or if we're only thinking about it in the context of the war on drugs and like arrest of low-level drug dealers, which is often a kind of focal point of prisons, we're not seeing the whole story, right? And I think the part of the point of the archive is that we're not trying to pick, the good prisoners or the innocent prisoners and separate them from the bad ones or the guilty ones. We're trying to create an archive as open and expansive as possible, right? Because all of those stories are necessary if we want to have an accounting of the institution.
All right, thank you, Dan. All good things have to come to an end. Can I ask Charity and Mark to come up on stage? And we will wrap up the history lecture series for 2026, and we hope to see you here next year in 2027.